The sterile scent of antiseptics hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint musk of a dozen alien species awaiting treatment. Dr. Vlar moved methodically through his clinic, his elongated fingers hovering over diagnostic screens as he assessed the vitals of a reptilian zephyr with a fractured exoskeleton. The creature's 3 yellow eyes blinked in gratitude as Vlar applied a regrowth serum, its cracked plates slowly knitting back together. Another success. Another patient stabilized. Yet when the doors slid open and the heavy, uneven footsteps echoed through the clinic, an instinctive dread coiled around his twin hearts. The figure in the doorway was unmistakable. A human. Blood smeared his face, a deep gash cut across his forehead, and his arm hung at an unnatural angle. His breathing was ragged, labored, but his eyes, a piercing blue, remained sharp despite the obvious pain. "Help, please," the human rasped, his voice raw with exhaustion. He staggered forward, barely catching himself against the nearest counter, sending a tray of delicate instruments clattering to the floor. A few alien patients recoiled, murmuring in hushed tones. Vlar stood frozen, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The human was an apex predator. A species notorious for its aggression, adaptability, and relentless survival instincts. Though his own people, the Yllari, had long studied human biology, they had done so at a distance, always wary of the creatures who had conquered their own planet's harshest environments. A human in need of medical assistance was a paradox. It was unnatural. It was dangerous. "I do not treat humans," Vlar said, his voice even though his throat felt tight. He straightened his posture, keeping a professional veneer, but his fingers twitched involuntarily. "You must leave." A nearby assistant, a feline-like erection, hesitated. "Doctor, he is badly wounded. If he does not receive treatment, then he will heal as his kind always does," Vlar interrupted. "Or he will not. Either way, it is not our concern." The human let out a bitter chuckle, though the movement sent a sharp tremor through his frame. "Well, that's just perfect," he muttered, shaking his head. "You know, for a doctor, that's a hell of a stance to take." More murmurs rippled through the clinic. A Sorthian, its translucent skin pulsing with curiosity, leaned closer to another patient, whispering. Vlar could feel the scrutiny tightening around him. He was a healer, yes, but even among his kind the belief remained. Humans were not to be treated like the others. They were a force of nature, a predator at the top of the chain. Offering aid to something like that could only invite disaster. The human took another step, swaying dangerously. His vision blurred for a moment, but he blinked rapidly, forcing himself to stay upright. "I didn't exactly choose to get mauled by whatever the hell that thing was," he said, voice strained. "And I sure as hell didn't expect to be turned away because I've got the wrong number of stomachs or something." Vlar's jaw tightened. It would be easier to look away, to let nature take its course. But the weight of the watching eyes pressed in on him. Even those who shared his unease were waiting, expecting something. His reputation was built on skill, on his ability to treat any species that entered his clinic. And now, in this moment, he was being asked to put that reputation to the test. He could not do it. "I will not risk my staff or my patients," Vlar said, lifting his chin. "You must leave." The human exhaled sharply, a sound that could have been a laugh or sheer frustration. His fingers tightened around the counter's edge. For a moment, it seemed as if he might argue, might push forward despite the warning. Then his body betrayed him. His knees buckled and he crumpled to the floor. A collective gasp rippled through the clinic. The erection assistant moved instinctively, but Vlar shot out a hand, stopping him. He was not heartless, but he would not allow sentimentality to dictate his actions. "Find someone else," he said, voice quiet but firm. A new voice cut through the charged silence. "Someone else, huh? Lucky for you, I'm already here." The clinic's entrance hummed open again, and a man strode inside with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. He was human as well, though something about him radiated a different energy. His coat was well worn, his demeanor calm. His brown eyes swept over the scene before landing on the crumpled form of his fellow human. He sighed. "Well, that's not good." Vlar stiffened as the newcomer knelt beside the injured man and began assessing him with smooth, efficient movements. "Who are you?" Vlar demanded. "Dr. Marcus Reynolds," the man answered without looking up. "Veterinarian." Vlar blinked. "You are a doctor for non-sentient species?" Reynolds smirked. Yep. And humans too when the occasion calls for it. He pressed 2 fingers to the injured man's neck, then began examining his wound. Good news, he's not dead. Bad news. If we don't set this arm and close up that head wound, he's going to have a real bad day. Vlar could not believe what he was witnessing. This was a human treating another human with the same casual confidence that he himself had when tending to the clinic's usual patients. You cannot possibly expect me to allow this, Vlar said, though his voice lacked the same conviction as before. Reynolds arched a brow. Why not? You're not going to do it, right? Silence stretched between them. Reynolds gave a small shake of his head and turned back to his patient. Hold still, buddy, he murmured, then began working. The clinic watched, hushed, as the human doctor tended to his kind with practiced ease. Vlar felt the weight of the moment settle over him, the certainty that whatever came next would change everything. And for the first time in his long career he was not sure if he was ready for it. Dr. Marcus Reynolds worked with the detached precision of a man who had seen worse, his hands moving fluidly as he assessed the injured human before him. The clinic was silent but for the occasional beep of medical instruments and the rustling movements of anxious alien onlookers. He could feel their eyes on him, brimming with curiosity and skepticism, but he ignored them. Right now his only concern was stabilizing the unconscious man sprawled on the floor. Reynolds murmured a quiet reassurance as he pressed gauze to the head wound, slowing the bleeding. You're going to be all right, buddy, he said, his tone firm but calm. He retrieved a bone stabilizer from his med kit and set to work on the fractured arm. The aliens watching flinched slightly as he adjusted the limb with practiced ease. The faint crunch of bone snapping back into alignment sent a ripple of discomfort through them. Vlar observed the scene with a rigid stance, his expression unreadable. Though his instinct still screamed at him that this was a mistake, he could not deny that Reynolds worked with expertise, with a clinical detachment that defied every tale he had heard about human unpredictability. There was no aggression, no wild emotion. Only a doctor treating a patient regardless of species. You do this often? Vlar finally asked, his voice measured. Reynolds didn't look up. Patch up injuries? Yeah. Humans aren't the only stubborn creatures that get themselves into trouble. I've treated plenty of things with sharper teeth than us. Vlar hesitated. Yet you are a veterinarian. You specialize in non-sentient beings. Biology is biology, Reynolds replied. And I don't like seeing things suffer. He finished wrapping the stabilizer around the human's arm, securing it in place. Even if they're apex predators, as you put it. A murmur ran through the clinic. Some aliens exchanged uncertain glances. Others seemed fascinated by the interaction. The tension in the room had shifted, replaced by something more contemplative, less fearful. Vlar crossed his arms. You are unafraid? Reynolds let out a small chuckle. Why would I be? He's unconscious. Not much of a threat like this, is he? His humor was dry, but it made a few of the aliens blink in surprise, as if humor itself was an unexpected trait in an apex predator. Vlar exhaled slowly. He had spent years studying medical science, understanding the intricate systems of countless species. And yet, in this moment, he felt as if he were the one being studied, as if this human before him, this unshaken, confident doctor, had just exposed something flawed in his carefully cultivated beliefs. You think I am wrong, Vlar stated, though it was not quite a question. Reynolds met his gaze for the first time since entering the clinic. I think you're scared, he said simply. And I think fear makes people aliens, draw lines where there shouldn't be any. Vlar stiffened, but Reynolds was already turning back to his patient. The conversation was over for now. The human doctor had more pressing concerns. He reached for a dermal regenerator and began sealing the head wound, working with steady hands, utterly unfazed by the situation. Vlar glanced at the aliens still watching, their expressions filled with something new, uncertainty perhaps, but also curiosity. He had spent so long believing humans were untouchable, unpredictable forces of nature. And yet, here was one, treating another with the same level of care that Vlar himself would have given to any of his own patients. No fear. No hesitation. For the first time in his career, Vlar wondered if he had misjudged humanity entirely. The clinic was still, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Vlar found himself watching as Reynolds finished the last of his work, the injured human now breathing in slow, steady rhythms. The shift was almost imperceptible, but Vlar could feel the mood in the room had changed. The fear that had once held every being tense had dulled, giving way to something closer to curiosity, even understanding. Reynolds exhaled and rocked back on his heels, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. "He'll be fine now," he said, rising to his feet. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as though this were just another routine case. "Just needs time." Vlar studied the unconscious human, his mind still caught in the web of questions that had been forming since Reynolds had arrived. The ease with which the human doctor had taken control of the situation defied every expectation he had. He had thought humans were reckless, instinct-driven creatures. Yet this one had moved with purpose, his actions deliberate, his knowledge undeniable. And more than that, he had not hesitated. A patient had needed help. He had provided it. Without question. Without fear. "You could have let him die," Vlar murmured, his voice quieter than he intended. "You chose not to." Reynolds gave him a long look, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Of course I chose not to. That's what doctors do." Vlar's fingers tightened slightly. "Not all doctors." Reynolds sighed and crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "You know, I get it," he said, his voice softer now. "Humans freak you out. We don't fit neatly into your classifications. Too adaptable. Too unpredictable. You think we're dangerous." Vlar met his gaze but said nothing. Reynolds tilted his head slightly, considering. "But let me tell you something. You're not wrong about humans being apex predators. We are. But do you know what really makes us dangerous? It's not our strength. Not our endurance. It's that we care." Vlar frowned, caught off guard by the statement. Reynolds gestured toward the unconscious human. "He's not my friend. I don't know him. But I saw someone in trouble and I helped him. Not because I had to. Not because he's human. But because he needed it. That's what we do. We protect our own. How we protect things that aren't our own. That's why humans have domesticated half the creatures on our planet, why we've put ourselves in danger to save species we had no reason to care about. That's why I've spent years treating animals that don't even understand what I'm doing for them. We fight. We build. We protect. And that is why you should be afraid of us." The words settled into the air like a weight, pressing against Vlar's carefully constructed understanding of humanity. He had always feared their unpredictability, their capacity for violence. He had never once considered that their greatest threat was their capacity for compassion. The thought was unsettling. More so because deep down he knew it was true. For the first time, Vlar saw humanity not as a species to be feared, but as something far more complicated. More dangerous, yes, but perhaps in a way he had never understood before. He turned back to Reynolds, measuring his words carefully. "And do you believe this care extends to all species? Or only your own?" Reynolds smiled, small and knowing. "Well, I'm here, aren't I?" The response silenced whatever rebuttal Vlar had been forming. He looked once more at the human lying on the treatment table, the bruises already beginning to fade, the wound on his head closing cleanly. He would recover as humans always did. But it was not his resilience that struck Vlar now. It was the certainty that, given the chance, this same human would have done the same for another. Perhaps even for him. Vlar exhaled slowly, then inclined his head. "You should return when he wakes. He will likely have questions." Reynolds nodded. "Yeah. I figured." For the first time, the silence between them felt less like a divide and more like an understanding. The clinic's tension had faded, the watching patients and staff no longer fearful but contemplative. Something had shifted here today, something Vlar could not yet put into words. But as Reynolds turned to leave, he found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "Dr. Reynolds." The human paused, glancing back. Vlar hesitated only a moment. "If another human were to come seeking help, I would not turn them away." Reynolds studied him, then smiled. Not the smirk he had worn before, not the amused grin of a man making a point, but something smaller, something real. "Good," he said. "That's how it starts." And with that he left, leaving Vlar standing in the center of his clinic, staring after him and wondering just how much had truly changed in the span of a single night. The clinic had returned to its usual rhythm, yet a subtle undercurrent of change lingered in the air. Vlar moved through the sterile hallways with measured steps, his mind restless despite the quiet hum of medical machinery and the hushed voices of his colleagues. His interaction with Dr. Reynolds had unsettled something deep within him, something that refused to be neatly categorized. He had spent years constructing a framework of understanding about humans, dangerous, unpredictable, an anomaly among the sentient species of the galaxy. And yet, in a single night, that certainty had fractured. Reynolds had not only treated the injured human with efficiency and care but had also confronted Vlar's own deeply ingrained biases with a calm, unwavering conviction. And perhaps most unsettling of all, Vlar had listened. He found himself pausing outside the room where the injured human rested, still unconscious but stable. The monitor beside him beeped steadily, the rhythmic pulse of life undeterred by the events that had led him here. Vlar hesitated, then stepped inside, standing at the foot of the bed as he studied the human's face. The bruising had faded slightly, the skin knitting itself back together with the help of regenerative treatment. He exhaled slowly. Would he have helped this man if Reynolds had not intervened? If the human doctor had not forced him to confront the quiet truth lurking in the back of his mind? He wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that he would have made the right choice, that his years of medical training would have overridden his fears. But the weight in his chest told him otherwise. A quiet knock at the door drew his attention. He turned to find a fellow medic, a Tvani healer named Joresh, standing with an unreadable expression. "You were in deep thought," Joresh observed, stepping inside and letting the door slide shut behind him. "I would not have interrupted, but it seemed important." Vlar straightened. "I was considering the patient's recovery." Joresh tilted his head, his silver eyes flicking toward the unconscious human. "He will survive. You ensured that?" Vlar was silent. Joresh studied him for a moment before speaking again, his voice quieter this time. "Word has spread of what happened. Of how the human Reynolds treated his own kind without hesitation." Vlar nodded. "It was unexpected." "Was it?" Joresh countered. "Or was it simply outside what we chose to believe?" The words settled heavily between them. Vlar glanced back at the human as if the answer could be found in the steady rise and fall of his chest. "I once asked Reynolds if his kind's compassion extended beyond their own species," he admitted. "And what did he say?" Joresh asked. Vlar exhaled. "He said, 'Well, I'm here, aren't I?'" A flicker of something passed over Joresh's face. Understanding, perhaps, or something close to it. Vlar looked back at the human. "I told Reynolds I would not turn another away." The words felt strange on his tongue, as if saying them out loud made the commitment more real, more binding. Joresh was quiet for a moment before he nodded. "Then perhaps, Vlar, you have taken your first step toward seeing them as they truly are." Vlar did not answer, but something within him shifted. The patient stirred, a faint groan escaping his lips as consciousness pulled him from the depths of healing sleep. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, before locking onto Vlar with something between confusion and recognition. Vlar met his gaze, and for the first time he did not feel fear. Instead, he inclined his head slightly and spoke. "You are safe." The human blinked at him, then let out a weak, breathy chuckle. "Didn't think I'd wake up to an alien saying that," he muttered, his voice hoarse but carrying a trace of wry amusement. Vlar found himself almost smiling. "Perhaps," he said, "that is something that should change." The human shifted slightly, wincing as he attempted to sit up. His movements were slow, hesitant, weighed down by both injury and exhaustion. Vlar resisted the instinct to intervene, instead observing as the man tested his own limits. There was something admirable in that stubborn resilience, though he supposed it was an intrinsic trait of the species. "You are in a medical facility," Vlar stated, his voice measured. "Your injuries have been stabilized. You should refrain from unnecessary movement." The human exhaled sharply, a sound that might have been amusement if not for the underlying strain. "Yeah, well, not much of a fan of lying around." His gaze flicked around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then, his eyes locked onto Vlar with an intensity that sent a ripple of unease through the alien doctor. "You're not human." It was not an accusation nor a statement of fear, simply an observation, but one laced with careful scrutiny. "No," Vlar admitted. "I am Vlar of the Zevran Medical Corps." The human nodded slowly as if filing the information away. "Right. And you're the one who patched me up?" There was a pause before Vlar answered. "No," he said honestly. "Dr. Reynolds, a human, treated your injuries. I merely ensured your continued recovery." The human's brow furrowed slightly as if trying to recall a missing memory. Reynolds. He let the name settle on his tongue before shaking his head. Don't know him. But I owe him one, I guess. Vlar studied him. Does it surprise you that another human would come to your aid? The man let out a rough chuckle. Not really. We look out for each other. His expression shifted, something unreadable passing through his eyes. But you though. You're not human. And yet here I am. Still breathing. Vlar did not immediately respond. Instead he considered the unspoken meaning behind the words. There was no malice, no direct challenge. Only curiosity, perhaps a trace of something deeper. I took an oath, Vlar finally said. To preserve life where I can. The human's lips quirked slightly. Even when that life belongs to an apex predator? Vlar exhaled through his nose, the faintest echo of a chuckle in the sound. It would seem my perspective on that matter has evolved. The human regarded him for a long moment, then extended a hand. Nathan Cole, he said. Vlar hesitated before reaching out, clasping the human's hand in a gesture he knew carried significance in their culture. The warmth of the contact was strange but not unpleasant. Vlar, he replied. Nathan's grip was firm despite his weakened state, but there was no aggression in it, only a quiet acknowledgement. When he released it he settled back against the bed with a small sigh. So what happens now? Vlar glanced toward the door where he knew Reynolds would return soon. That will depend on many factors. But for now you must focus on healing. Nathan smirked slightly. Yeah. Doctor's orders. Vlar found himself inclining his head. Precisely. As the human closed his eyes, exhaustion tugging at him once more, Vlar remained where he was, watching. He had once believed that humans were to be feared, that their very nature made them an anomaly in the grand order of sentient life. But now, standing in this quiet room, he found himself contemplating a new question entirely. Perhaps humanity's greatest danger was not their strength, nor their resilience. Perhaps it was their ability to change the hearts of those who once feared them. Dr. Reynolds arrived not long after, his familiar, unhurried gait announcing his presence before he even stepped into the room. The human doctor cast a quick glance at Nathan, taking in his vitals with the casual expertise of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Satisfied, he turned his attention to Vlar, an easy smirk already forming. Well, look at that. He's still alive, Reynolds quipped. Nathan cracked one eye open, his voice dry. Disappointed? Reynolds chuckled. Not in the slightest. Means I don't have to fill out a death report. Paperwork's a nightmare. Vlar watched the exchange in silence, his gaze flicking between the two humans. There was something effortless about the way they spoke, a current of camaraderie forming between them despite the fact that they had never met before today. He had seen it before, this innate human ability to forge bonds quickly, as if their shared existence was enough reason to trust each other. It was disconcerting, and yet strangely fascinating. Reynolds moved closer to the bed, tilting his head as he studied Nathan. How's the pain? Nathan shifted slightly, testing his movements with a wince. Manageable. I've had worse. Reynolds nodded. Good. Means you're healing. His tone remained light, but there was something in his expression, an unspoken understanding. Vlar observed this carefully. Humans often communicated in ways that were difficult to quantify, subtle shifts in body language, tone, and expression conveying things words did not. It was an aspect of their species that had made them unpredictable to outsiders. But standing in this room, watching the way Reynolds and Nathan instinctively recognized something in each other, Vlar wondered if it was less about unpredictability and more about something far simpler. Recognition. Reynolds exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. You're lucky, you know. Could have gone a lot worse. Nathan huffed a short, tired laugh. Yeah, I got that impression. His gaze flicked toward Vlar, something unreadable in his eyes. So, I take it our good doctor here wasn't too keen on treating me at first? Vlar stiffened slightly. He had expected the question, but that did not make it any easier to answer. Reynolds, however, shrugged. To be fair, it's not every day an alien vet gets a human dumped on their doorstep. And let's be honest, we do have a bit of a reputation. Nathan smirked. For being hard to kill? For being a walking paradox, Reynolds corrected. The galaxy sees us as apex predators, but we'll throw ourselves into danger to save creatures that have no business surviving. We're adaptable, stubborn, damn near impossible to predict. His gaze flicked to Vlar. Make some people nervous. Vlar did not immediately respond. The truth in Reynolds' words was undeniable, and yet there was something more. Something he had not fully considered until now. It was not just unpredictability that made humans unsettling. It was the way they defied expectation at every turn. I was afraid, Vlar admitted at last. The words felt strange, unfamiliar on his tongue, but he did not regret them. Nathan's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his face before settling into something quieter. Yeah, he murmured. I get that a lot. There was no bitterness in his tone, only understanding. It was the same quiet acceptance Reynolds carried, the same acknowledgement that fear was simply part of what it meant to be human in a galaxy that did not always know what to make of them. Vlar inclined his head. I am re-evaluating my perspective. Reynolds grinned. Good. Means there's hope for you yet. Nathan let out another breathy chuckle, shaking his head. So, what now? Vlar considered the question carefully before answering. Now, he said, you recover. It was a simple answer, but perhaps for now it was enough. Nathan remained in the clinic for 3 more days, his body recovering at a pace that seemed to defy logic. Another quirk of human resilience that Vlar had come to accept, if not entirely understand. Though he still required rest, the wounds were healing with remarkable efficiency, the regenerative treatments working in tandem with his own biology. Reynolds visited often, bringing with him a sense of casual normalcy that seemed to ease the tension lingering beneath the surface. He spoke to Nathan the way one might chat with an old friend, their conversations effortless, laced with dry humor and an undercurrent of mutual respect. Vlar watched these interactions with quiet interest, still unraveling the nuances of human behavior. Nathan, for his part, had taken to watching Vlar just as closely. There was no hostility in his gaze nor distrust, only curiosity. It was unnerving at first to be studied so openly, but Vlar forced himself to endure it. He had spent years observing humans from a distance, shaping his perceptions based on reports and second-hand knowledge. Now the scrutiny had been turned back on him. You don't talk much, Nathan remarked one afternoon, breaking the quiet as Vlar checked his vitals. Vlar paused briefly before responding. I speak when necessary. Nathan smirked. Sounds exhausting. Vlar arched a brow. You find silence exhausting? More like suspicious, Nathan admitted. When people stop talking, it usually means they're either planning something or trying to figure out if they should be worried about you. Vlar considered this. And which do you believe applies to me? Nathan tilted his head, studying him. Honestly, haven't decided yet. Vlar was not sure how to respond to that, but Nathan's smirk suggested he was not expecting an answer. The tension between them had lessened over the past few days, shifting into something more measured, perhaps even an understanding. Vlar no longer felt the same undercurrent of apprehension when standing in the human's presence, and he suspected Nathan had reached a similar conclusion about him. The moment solidified later that evening when Vlar entered Nathan's room to find him sitting upright, watching the holographic display affixed to the far wall. It projected a rotating model of a Zevran biological structure, a simplified representation used for medical reference. Nathan glanced over as Vlar approached. Been meaning to ask, he said, nodding toward the display. How much do you actually know about human biology? Vlar folded his hands behind his back. I have studied the available data. Nathan raised a brow. Yeah. And before me, how many humans have you treated? Vlar hesitated. None. Nathan let out a low whistle. Well, guess that explains a few things. Vlar straightened slightly. You are suggesting I lacked sufficient knowledge to provide effective treatment? Nathan shrugged. Not saying you did a bad job. Just saying it's different when you have to do it for real. He leaned back against the pillows, exhaling. You get used to people throwing assumptions at you when you're human. Half the galaxy thinks we're monsters, the other half thinks we're some kind of curiosity. Vlar was quiet for a moment before he spoke. And what do you believe? Nathan's expression shifted slightly, something more thoughtful settling over his features. I think we're just people, he said finally. Complicated, messy, hard to kill. But people same as anyone else. Vlar considered this. It was a simple answer, yet it carried a weight that was difficult to ignore. He had spent so long categorizing humans, defining them by the traits that made them exceptional or dangerous. But in the end, perhaps Nathan was right. Perhaps they were just people. Before he could respond, the clinic doors slid open, and Reynolds stepped inside with his usual air of casual confidence. He glanced between them, then smirked. "You two bonding?" Nathan rolled his eyes. "If that's what you want to call it." Reynolds chuckled. "Good. Means I won't have to break up any fights." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorway. "Hope you're ready for some good news. You're getting discharged tomorrow." Nathan let out a slow breath, nodding. Figured it was about that time. Vlar felt an unexpected pang of something he could not quite define. It was not regret exactly, but there was a strange sense of finality to the moment. Reynolds clapped his hands together. "Get some rest. You'll need your strength for the paperwork." Nathan groaned. "And here I thought I was free." Reynolds grinned. "Welcome to the real world." Vlar remained silent as they exchanged words, watching the easy camaraderie between them. He was beginning to understand that humans did not require long histories to form connections. Sometimes survival was enough. As he turned to leave the room, Nathan's voice stopped him. "Hey Vlar." He looked back. Nathan offered a small, genuine nod. "Thanks." Vlar held his gaze for a long moment before inclining his head. "You are welcome,